The prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament, writing or speaking 600 years before Jesus, wrote this. This is God speaking through him. I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness. I will also hold you by the hand and watch over you, and I will appoint you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the nations. You can go through the Old Testament prophets, and verses like that are there time and time again, that when the Messiah would come, it would be a light for all men and women all over the world. Do you remember that dear old guy Simeon? Sometimes we talk about this at Christmas. When Jesus was born, Mary and Joseph were only poor, and they went to the temple to have him circumcised in Jerusalem. There was a man there called Simeon, a very old man. There's a lady as well called Anna, and both of them were waiting for this. They knew the Old Testament, and they were waiting for the Messiah to come. And God seems to have opened Simeon's eyes, and as he takes the baby Jesus, 8 days old, in his arms, you can read it in Luke chapter 2, he says, this child is a light for the nations. And he says other things about Jesus as well, and other things to Mary about how it would pierce her heart with grief one day, and she would be there and see him crucified. He was a kind of prophet, Simeon. But this idea that Jesus is a light for all. What should this mean to you? Well, we've said it already, haven't we? It means that God's promises through the prophets in the Old Testament and fulfilled in Jesus in the New Testament are not for one exclusive people group, but they're for you. They're for all. That means there is no barrier preventing you from coming to God through Jesus. There is an open door. All of these promises, the whole of the Bible, it's for you. You can believe it, and you can walk through that open door, and no one can stop you. No one can say you're not a Jew, you don't wear the right clothes, you can walk through that door because the Bible and these promises, Jesus is for you. So that's the first thing the prophet spoke about, grace to come to you. Second thing that he spoke about was this amazing idea that this Messiah would suffer. What's that all about? This is a massive deal. There are many passages in the prophets in the Old Testament that speak of great victory, of a strong, powerful, eternal, wise ruler who would come like a king, conquering all his enemies. And then Jesus comes, and he's born in Nazareth, the son of a carpenter, poor, obscure. It's like the Messiah being born in like Barnsley or Rotherham. You'd think he would live in a palace in London. That's why the Jewish leaders had so much of an issue. How can you be the Messiah? But it's more than that, isn't it? What must it have been for them when Jesus was lifted up to die on a cross like a criminal? And these religious leaders in their fine clothes walking past the cross and shouting up at Jesus, you called yourself the Christ? Come down off the cross and then we'll believe in you. How can you be the Messiah when you're dying? They didn't know their own Bibles. The prophets who spoke these things in the Old Testament longed to know how on earth this could be brought to pass. A great king and a suffering servant, we just can't fit that together. And you can't until Jesus comes on the scene and marries all of those ideas in one person. Just go back with me to the prophet Isaiah again. We're not going to cover the whole of the Old Testament, but here's a couple of things I want to show you. Isaiah chapter 53. This is in the Jewish Old Testament scriptures. These religious leaders would have known these words off by heart. And what does it say about, this is Isaiah writing into his own time, but predicting Christ. Look at what it says in verse 4 of Isaiah 53, page 740 if you've got a church Bible. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows, yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. Why did the Messiah have to suffer? He suffered in the place of sinful, broken people, paying the penalty for sins that we really should pay. Jesus was put to grief, not because he was the bad guy, but because he said, "Here am I, send me. I'll take the rap so that they can be forgiven." And it's amazing, this chapter. Look at what it says. It says he didn't speak. When he stood in front of Pilate and Herod, it says in the Gospels that he wouldn't answer their questions. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. There was a man called Joseph of Arimathea, a rich man, who gave his family tomb for Jesus to be buried in. It's right there in the Old Testament, 600 years before Jesus was even born. Just flick back with me to a psalm, Psalm 22. We could go all over the place, we haven't got time. Psalm 22, a few pages further back. Page 554 in the church Bibles. These are the words of David. King under great pressure. This is how he feels in his emotions. But it's got a double meaning. And look at what he says from verse 12. He's speaking about himself, but you tell me what this reminds you of. Many bulls surround me, strong bulls of Bashan encircle me, roaring lions tearing their prey, open their mouths wide against me. I'm poured out like water, my bones are all out of joint. My heart has turned to wax and melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs have surrounded me. A band of evil men have encircled me. They have pierced my hands and my feet. I can count all my bones. People stare and gloat over me. And get this verse. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. What are we told? When Jesus was crucified, the soldiers threw dice and to make so they could win the purple cloth that he was wearing. It's right there, 1,000 years before Jesus was born, in the Old Testament predicted. And it wasn't people who were trying to make this come true that did it. It was Roman soldiers, callous men who were just doing their thing. And yet there it is, predicted. We could go all through the Old Testament. The Messiah was born to die. It's all there. They knew it. They knew these words off by heart. So, the prophet's themes: grace to come to you, and a Messiah who would be born one day, who is a great king, yes, but would suffer so that that grace could be delivered to you. They're big themes, aren't they? Over hundreds of years in the Old Testament, pointing to Jesus.